Number 1. Chuckles. There was an old and abandoned asylum right off of the town that I live in. Nowadays it has been cleaned out and is used to give ghost tours. I've been to it a couple times since it reopened. I don't really believe in ghosts and don't think that it is haunted. And really, now that it has been cleaned up, it's really nowhere near as scary as it was before. The reason I know this is I've been in the hospital after it had been closed down for decades, but before it reopened as a haunted tour. When I was growing up, we had a lot of stories about the place. They were the sort of stories you would expect from a huge abandoned building that used to house a bunch of crazy people. It probably didn't help that the place was built outside of town, in a heavily forested area. That just made it much creepier than it would have been otherwise. I think this is a pretty common story with regards to abandoned hospitals and asylums. You always hear the story about one patient that was left in the building after it closed down. My town, of course, had several of these stories. I recall one of them was about a mentally deranged patient who they referred to as Chuckles. Apparently, the story goes that when the hospital closed down, they had to release all of the patients free into the world. Chuckles, however, was so insane that the doctors didn't feel good about unleashing him onto the world. So instead, they strapped him down to a gurney, rolled him into the quiet room, and locked him in. From there, the story takes several different directions, depending upon who was telling it. Some people claim that Chuckles simply starved to death, because he either couldn't unstrap himself from the gurney, nor could he get out of the quiet room. Others say he did get out, and he lived by himself in the abandoned hospital. He would roam around in the forest surrounding the hospital, finding food to live on. They also claimed he would kidnap kids if they were hiking in the forest, or that if teenagers had pulled into the forested area to make out in their cars, Chuckles would come upon the car and kill them. My personal belief was that this was all total bull. One day when I was 15, my buddy Eric and I were pretty bored. He suggested that we hike through the woods and try to find the old asylum. I was cool with it. Like I said, I didn't believe in any of the old stories. So, we set out through the woods trying to locate the place. It didn't really take us very long, since there was an old gravel road that led towards the front gate. The building was pretty huge. It was covered in graffiti, and the brush was completely overgrown. We assumed that since it was private property, that it was likely that there was a caretaker of some sort. But fortunately, if there was, we didn't run into him. Eric and I made it through the grounds and up to the building. We were looking for a broken door, or a broken window so we could get in. Eventually, we came across a window that was covered with a piece of plywood. We managed to pull the plywood off the window without really making too much noise. We then lowered ourselves through the window and into a room. As I mentioned before, I have since taken the ghost tour at this building. Nowadays, it is pretty much emptied out. But when Eric and I broke in, it was pretty shocking to us how completely unkempt the place was. There were gurneys, wheelchairs, and other hospital equipment that was rusty and strewn throughout the rooms and hallways. It almost seemed like, when they had closed it, they just left the trash everywhere. Trust me when I say that when we broke into the hospital, the place was infinitely creepier than the ghost tours ever were. They do the tours in the dark, but it's not so bad because there are not only a lot of people around, but there's really barely anything in any of the rooms. Plus now, the doors have all been taken down. While Eric and I were walking around in the hospital, the doors were still up, and many of the doors were closed and locked. There was tons of garbage everywhere, and equipment that anyone could be hiding behind. I honestly felt like I was being watched the entire time. I can't recall really how long Eric and I were in the hospital. We spent a good amount of time exploring. Eventually, Eric had gotten a little ahead of me when I was exploring what looked like some sort of operating room. He began shouting at me, telling me that he had found something, and he sounded urgent. I ran over to him. He was standing in front of a big door. It seemed heavier than the rest. He was trying to open it. When I got there, I saw what had gotten his attention. It was a quiet room. Someone had put graffiti on the door, which read, Chuckles. Eric was unable to open the door, but it did have a small window in it. He took his flashlight, shined it in the room, and told me to look inside. When I did, my heart nearly stopped. In the room was a gurney with broken straps on it. On the floor, in one of the corners, was what looked like a long since dead body. It was decayed beyond belief, but it was definitely a dead body. It sincerely creeped us out, and we eventually left. Since then, when we took the ghost tour, the door had been removed. There was no gurney left in the room. What's most weird is that the tour guide never mentioned anything about Chuckles. You would think they would, since it's a pretty freaky story. I mean, what is scarier than a person so psychotic that he was strapped to a gurney and left to die in an abandoned hospital? It gives me the shivers even today.
Number 2. Psych Ward. Years ago, I self-committed myself to a psychiatric ward. It wasn't for anything too serious, though. I was just having issues with depression. I also was having problems sleeping. If you've never been in a psych ward before, you may not know what it is like. They are, of course, not like you see in the movies. The one I was in was a really clean, well-kept place. The people working there were all really nice. I had a nice bed in a room all to myself. It even had its own bathroom. The worst thing about being in a psychiatric ward, however, is the boredom. Everything is very organized. They have a distinct bedtime, too. I know that this sort of thing is supposed to be good for people with insomnia problems. Still, it was really difficult for me. I'm very much a night person. I like sleeping in and staying up late. But at 10 p.m., all the patients had to take their medication and go to bed. Even though they gave me sleeping pills, it was pretty aggravating because I still couldn't fall asleep so early. The first few nights were pretty terrible. The medication they gave me was Zolpidem. It didn't really help me go to sleep though. And if you know much about Zolpidem, it also can make you hallucinate if you don't fall asleep. I was quite aware of this, but was having so much trouble not sleeping that I was willing to risk it. On the third or fourth night that I was there, about an hour after I was given the medication, I was tossing and turning in bed. I turned over and opened my eyes when I heard a noise. Glancing over at my bathroom door, I saw the door slowly begin to open. It didn't open very much, but it was enough for me to see most of a face in the crack of the door. I couldn't make the face out very well. It wasn't anyone I had seen before. It didn't acknowledge me in any way. I froze at first. My brain was pretty foggy, but I had enough wherewithal to know that I was likely hallucinating. So rather than freak out and call for anyone, I just tried to close my eyes and go to sleep. As I lay there though, I kept thinking about the face in the crack of the door. It really made it even more difficult for me to be able to sleep, but I truly believed it was a hallucination, so I tried to just keep my eyes closed. I figured it would go away, and I would eventually be lucky enough to just fall asleep. After a while, I realized that the curiosity was going to keep me from falling asleep anyway, so finally, I rolled over on my back and opened my eyes. A shock reverberated throughout my body. The person from the bathroom was standing right over me, grinning down at me. I jumped from being startled, and the person reached down and put his hand right over my mouth to keep me from screaming. It was right then that I, of course, realized that it was a real person and not a hallucination. I had only been on the ward less than a week, and I figured I must not know everyone who was there yet. I struggled, but then the guy held me down firmly, his hand over my mouth and nose. All I could think to do as this guy was smothering me was flail around. I luckily hit the lamp on the nightstand and knocked it over onto the floor. The loud crashing sound startled the guy, but he still kept his hand over my mouth. Fortunately, the crash attracted the people at the night desk. They made it into the room and pulled the guy off me before he smothered me. He just kept looking at me, this time with a stern look on his face as they held him down. While I stood there, still in shock, an intern came in and they sedated the man. I found out later why I had not seen that particular patient before. He had been spending time isolated for behavioral issues. Apparently he had just been let out that day. Also, I have no doubt he went back in. I got discharged the next day. There was no way, even with my issues needing to be addressed, that I could spend another day there.
Number 3. Privacy. I absolutely need you to keep this story anonymous. I can't even tell you what state I live in, because even telling this story could get me in trouble. I'm a psychiatrist who works in the psychiatric wing of a hospital. It can definitely be a trying job sometimes, but I really like to think I can help people. So although it can be draining, trying to improve people's mental health can be very rewarding. I'm not sure if you're familiar with United States HIPAA privacy laws, but they are extremely protective of an individual's privacy. This is especially so in the case of therapy. If someone were to admit something to a therapist, and they were specifically seeking out therapy for this problem, psychiatrists and psychologists are forbidden from relaying that information to the police. This has, in times, presented me with some pretty terrible admissions that I had to keep secret. The worst one was about 10 years ago. A new patient was admitted into the wing. He was in his late teens, thin, sallow, and very depressed looking. His mother had found him in his bedroom, cutting large slashes into his body with a straight razor. She had taken him to the hospital where the wounds were treated. And since he was found to be a danger to himself, they admitted him to my care. I'll call him Kyle, although that definitely is not his real name. I've dealt with a lot of people who have pretty severe psychological issues. Kyle, though, was a bit different. If I had to diagnose him, he was suffering from an extremely severe conduct personality disorder. This is the type of teenager who kills small animals, for example. Very often, conduct disorder in a teenager will manifest itself into antisocial personality disorder as an adult. This is the technical term for what you would call a psychopath. Anyway, Kyle didn't really cause many problems on the ward, though. He really didn't talk much at all. This was unusual because, generally, conversation was the most common activity among the patients. Instead, he would just ignore everyone, and sit and stare at the TV, regardless of what was on. When the TV time was over, he would go into his room, lay on his bed, and stare at the ceiling. Kyle had been in the psychiatric wing for about 2 weeks when I was talking to him about why he was cutting himself. The subject had come up several times before, but he has always avoided it. I needed to know what was going on, though, so I brought it up in every therapy session we had. So the two of us were talking, and I didn't really expect to get any further with Kyle than I ever had before. But this time, when I asked Kyle why he was cutting himself, he quickly responded, "Because I wanted to see the way she felt when I cut her up the same way." I was shocked. I asked him to elaborate, and he simply said, if my mom hadn't stopped me, I would have known what she felt like when she bled to death. I, of course, asked Kyle who he was talking about. He didn't offer me any new information. All he said was that he had slashed some girl up the same way and that she had bled to death. He wanted to know how it felt. I didn't know if he was serious or not. I did the research, and there were no recent murders or missing girls in the area. So as far as I could figure, Kyle could have been lying. On the other hand, he could have been admitting to a murder. Kyle was aware that admitting to a crime, including murder, when seeking therapy in relation to that crime, prevents a doctor from contacting the authorities with that information. I literally had to keep his secret, which may have been why he might have made up the story and told me that. So the first thing that went through my mind was, if this kid really killed someone, he and I might be the only two people to ever know. In actuality, I think Kyle was making the story up. He probably got annoyed at me that I kept asking him why he was cutting himself. He was just that sort of kid. He was dark for the sake of being dark. But that didn't stop me from being scared to death of the kid. It also allowed me to keep him in the psychiatric ward for as long as I deemed necessary to protect others from him. He never mentioned it again, and he was kept under observation for a very long time. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. Also, feel free to share it with anyone you might think would enjoy it. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please hit the button next to the tabby to be informed of new content. Feel free to follow Ichigo and myself on Twitter and Facebook. I'd like to thank Being Scared for this collaboration. Please visit his channel by hitting the button to see the other half of the collaboration. Make sure to subscribe while you're over there. I think he's got a great voice, and he might end up being the next guy who I've collaborated with that ends up eventually being more popular than me. Check him out. I'm pretty sure you'll enjoy him. I know I've been away for a while. I'd worked so hard on my Halloween video that I got a bit burnt out for a while. I'm definitely revitalized now, however, and getting back to work. In the meantime, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.